Hello, so this is going to be question number 6 on the discussion. It's called like make your own lambdas. And so what's happening here is that we just want to really test your check your knowledge on like how lambda returns work and how like chaining lambdas together are okay. And so what we want to do here is we just want the function to not error, and we just want it to like return the value 3 for each case. And so one thing to keep in mind is that for f2, f3, there are like a bunch of multiple function calls, some of which take in a parameter, some of which don't. So you might imagine that f1 is going to return something, and in this case it's just going to return the value 3. So I'm going to put return 3 right there. So when f1 is called, I'm going to return 3. So that's our very first one, but anyways, moving on, the other ones get a bit more complicated. And so the thing to note is that since we see this being called twice, we know that f2 has to return a function that takes in no parameters. F2 when called is going to return a function, so this call right here. And then if we call it again, we're also passing in no parameters here, so it's going to return the value 3. And so what we're going to note is that the return value of f2, so f2 called right here, whatever we return, let's say it's x, when x is called, then it has to return the value 3. And so what we can do is we can create a function, so lambda, and then what we want to note is that there is no parameter that we take in. So because of that, we're going to have lambda just with colon, so meaning that it takes in no parameters. And what do we want to return? The value 3. So if we said that f2 call was x, and this is whatever x was, if we call this lambda function, then we would get the value 3 out of it, which is exactly what we want. Yeah, and so I'm going to bring that back. And moving on, what we have in the next one is this f3 call. And so the only difference between these two is that in the case of f2, we call it with no parameters afterwards. So we took this lambda and we called it with no parameters. But in the case of f3 right here, we do call it with the parameter 3. So what do we do to switch that up? We're going to essentially just add the extra parameter in. So return lambda x. So it's going to take in the parameter x. In this case, you can put like 3 or x. Doesn't really matter as long as you get the concept down. But if we imagine what happens here, f3 called is going to return this lambda x that just returns x. And then if we call it on 3, it's going to return x, which is 3. And yeah, so last but not least, we have f4. So f4 is a bit more complicated. So it has 3 function calls after you call f4. So what's going to happen is that f4 is going to give a function. So let me add a bunch of spaces down here. It's going to give a function. So I'm going to call this a. A stands for like maybe the first function. And then when I call a, it should return b. And then so here was the first call, f4, that's going to result in a. If I call a, it's going to result in b. And what do I do with b? I call it on the parameter 3. So if I call it on b, then I get another function called c. And then last but not least, if I call c on nothing, I should get the number 3 out of it. So if we notice, there's going to be there's going to be 3 nested functions. So a is the first function that's returned, doesn't take in any parameters, and it's going to return a function b that takes in 1 parameter, and it's going to return a function c that takes in no parameters, and then that c function is going to return the number 3. And so yeah, so if we were to replace this line of code right here, we can first start by defining that a function that we're returning. So it's going to take in no parameters, but what's it going to return? It's going to return another function. So it's going to return another lambda here, and then this lambda is now this b that we're talking about, it's taking in one parameter, and so because to address for that, count for that, we want to pass in lambda x, so it's taking in one parameter. And then what does this return? It's going to return another function. Wow, woohoo. And then this function is going to be c, and what do we know about this function c that we have here? It takes in no parameters, and it should return the number 3. And if you notice, it's pretty similar to this right here. So we could take that and put 3 right there, and it should do exactly as we want. And you can also put in x here. So although like this doesn't have the x parameter, if you imagine when you call the environment frame, it's going to look up in its parent, which is this lambda right here, and go like, oh, x is 3. And so x or 3, you're good to go. And so just to reiterate, what happens here is that if I call f4, so I'm going to like space this out, what it's going to return is this entire lambda function. And then I'm going to call it for the first time. So that first call. And then afterwards, what's going to happen is that it's going to return this lambda function within like the outer one. So a lot of nested lambdas right here. And then when I call it on the value 3, it's going to return this lambda at the very end. And then when I call this function again, it's going to return me x. And x in this case is going to be the value of 3. So everything works out. And yeah, so this is the end of question number 6. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. And yeah, have a great weekend, day, night, anything.